This week on Engage the Sage.
Hi everyone, I'm Don Saucier. Welcome to this week's episode of Engage the Stage. This week, I'm going to give you some tips about how to use PowerPoint to make your teaching excellent. In my video last week, I talked about why people do and why they should not fire hose their students with information, and actually said some of that might be related to a misuse of PowerPoint. PowerPoint is an amazing tool, and it is just that. It is a tool that helps us be excellent in our teaching. It's a way to organize our content, get information out to students in a really, really nice way. The issue is when people don't use PowerPoint correctly, it actually contributes to some of that fire hosing I think we should avoid. So now we've got 10 quick tips for how to use PowerPoint well and to make sure you're not fire hosing those students with content. My first tip for using PowerPoint well in your teaching is to use good color contrast on your slides. When I say good color contrast, I'm talking about a light background with dark font or a dark background with light font. You want to make it easy to see the text on your slides. I also recommend using the same color contrast on your slides throughout your semester. Once you found one that's worked with you, stay with it, make it easy, make it predictable, do it every time. Side note, I think that PowerPoint is an amazing tool, but some people go down a lot of rabbit holes when they're creating their PowerPoint slides. I think the focus should be on the substance of your slides, not the style. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time today talking about little things to make your slides super beautiful and pretty. I'm talking about practical ways to use PowerPoint, simple ways to use PowerPoint. My second tip for teaching with PowerPoint is to animate your slides. By animating my slides, what I mean is I'm going to set it up so that my information comes in point by point. When I click to my slide, I'll usually only have the title, and then the points come in one at a time when I want them to. What animating my slides is going to do is it's going to help make sure that I'm not giving too much information too quickly to my students, so literally avoiding that fire hose. The mistake I see people sometimes make is they will put up an entire slide with lots and lots of text all at once and then try to teach that content on the slide while their students are scrambling to write down everything that is on that slide. There's a couple problems with that. Number one, I find myself, I'm uncomfortable with that awkward silence while they're writing things down. So if I stop to let them write before I teach, which is what you should do when your students are writing, it makes it very uncomfortable for me. The issue is when I get uncomfortable and other people get uncomfortable with awkward silence, we start to talk. So what that often means is we won't give enough time for them to write down all of that content and we start to teach over it. Your students cannot listen and write at the same time. I'm going to say that again. Your students cannot listen and write at the same time. So when we give them too much information without animating it, they're not listening to the awesome things that we are teaching them. They're just focusing on writing down the content of the slide. My third tip in teaching with PowerPoint is to avoid putting too much content on your slides. Putting lots and lots of text on your slides is going to create problems. It's going to make it issues for students to write all of it down. It might have you use a font size that is too small for your students to easily see, and it gets very overwhelming and very intimidating. What I recommend instead is putting up only the key phrases or words that you need to remind you of what you want to teach your students. PowerPoint is a tool that helps us teach our students. It does not directly teach our students. Your students can read, they may have a textbook, they may have supplemental articles that you're reading in your class, but PowerPoint provides me an organization for a discussion that I will have with my students about the content. So it's going to consist for me of an outline with reminders, and then I teach the content using that as a guide. By keeping those slides less content-filled and less text-heavy, it also means your students don't have to pause as often to copy those slides down. They can focus more on listening and thinking about the content that you're sharing with them. Extending and amplifying this point, my fourth tip for teaching with PowerPoint is to adhere to the 4 C's. And what that means, if you've seen us talk about this before, is make sure those slides are clear, complete, concise, and compelling. My 6th recommendation for teaching with PowerPoint is to allow yourself flexibility to teach things and discuss things that are not on your PowerPoint slides. Your PowerPoint slides provide an organization and a set of reminders to help you teach your content to your students. It's giving you a structure. But while I said it should be clear, complete, concise, compelling, I don't mean that literally. What it should do is set up the opportunity to teach beyond those. And what this might mean is you might have to remind your students that in your class, taking notes effectively for future assessments will not just mean copying down the words on that slide. It might be writing down other stuff that you say or you discuss with your students as well. You should try to break that stereotype of when using PowerPoint, I click, you write. That should not be what we are trying to do. The PowerPoint should provide the inspiration and foundation for a much broader, useful, creative, innovative, and applied discussion of your content. When I use PowerPoint, I often use the whiteboard a lot as well to supplement my conversation. And I'll tell my students, by the way, because I think teaching them how to take notes in your class is important, that I do not have good handwriting on the board. If I ever write something on the board, you should probably take note of that as well. My sixth recommendation for teaching with PowerPoint is to be intentional about the content you include on your slides. I get asked all the time, how many slides should I teach in a 50-minute class? I have no idea. That's going to depend on how you organize your slides. What you should use as your motivation is not numbers of slides or numbers of lines on slides, but to think about what the slide is going to do. Think about how that slide is going to support the conversation you're going to have with your students about the content. When you've made those decisions about organization, and when you get more comfortable with how it is that you want to organize your class, you're going to develop a style and a routine for that class that helps you use PowerPoint to teach it. A couple specific tips I have about being intentional of that content. Number one, I don't love textbook definitions. If I'm going to put an actual definition on a slide, which might be rare, I'm much more likely to say that definition out loud and have my students take note of that then. But if I'm going to put a definition on the slide, I'm going to put a definition that is much more conversational and easier to remember. I'm going to give the definition that is the one that makes sense to me to inspire my students to think about things in ways that make sense to them. What I try not to do, and I see people do this all the time, is to have every PowerPoint slide be a new bold-faced term that happened in the textbook. If your PowerPoint slides are just a list of bold-faced terms that you then define, then your lecture or your conversation in class doesn't really have a narrative. It doesn't really have an arc to that story. And that's more what I'm shooting for. I'm trying to use my content to tell a story that makes sense to my students about what we're learning together. My seventh tip for teaching with PowerPoint is to personalize your slides. What I mean by personalizing your slides is making sure that those slides make sense to you so that you can teach from them well. You may have the opportunity to get slides from someone else. You may have the opportunity to get slides from a publisher that accompanies the textbook you use for your class. And I see a lot of people teach directly from those slides that someone else has given them. Often, though, when I'm doing observations when people are doing that, is I don't really feel that the instructor is very connected to those slides. I don't really feel like the transitions are set up in the way that the instructor might like. Sometimes I even see the instructor be confused by the content of that slide, not knowing what an example is supposed to mean, for instance. So I recommend, if you are going to use someone else's slides as the foundation for your lecture or your classroom conversation, make sure that you personalize them in a way that the content, the transitions, and the scaffolding of that information make sense to you. This will also make it more likely that you're demonstrating some authenticity in your teaching. Remember, I think we should bring peace to our classes. Preparation, expertise, authenticity, caring, and engagement. When we are authentically connected to the tools we use to teach, when we have had some genuine influence on the creation of those slides, I find it's easier for myself to demonstrate authenticity. My eighth recommendation for teaching with PowerPoint well is to practice your PowerPoint presentation. I find people often have the misconception that when their slides are done being prepared, that they are ready to teach. I found for myself that has never been the case. I need to go back through and make sure that I'm comfortable with the organization of the material. I know what follows what. I know the transitions. I know the scaffolding. And I know the overall purpose of that day's class. Those are things that don't come from just putting words on slides. This comes from thinking through, clicking through, and thinking about what I'm going to say. So if you want to teach well using PowerPoint, you probably should practice your PowerPoint. I'll also recommend, if you can, using that presenter view where it gives you an indication of what's coming up next when you click next. Super, super helpful in not getting off track, especially if you've gone on a tangent, so you know what's coming next. My ninth recommendation, and this is super important, my ninth recommendation for teaching with PowerPoint is understand that you're going to need to revise those PowerPoint slideshows over time. Over time, you're going to find those slides are going to change. I'm always revising my slideshows in classes that I use PowerPoint to teach in. One of the biggest revisions that I make in the evolution of my teaching is taking content off those slides. I am much more likely to have slides without many words on them just as reminders for me, for things that I want to talk about, examples that I want to share. But I'm finding that they're much less text heavy now than they were earlier in my career. So as I've gotten more comfortable with my content and I've come up with more ways to share that content, I've needed fewer explicit reminders, for instance, of what a definition of a term is. So rather than the PowerPoint being all of the information, it's a cue to me to share with them the information that I'm much more comfortable with. The other part to revising your PowerPoint slideshows is you're probably, over the course of your teaching, going to add and delete content. You're going to find things that you want to share. You're going to take some things out. One of the mistakes I sometimes make is I add stuff in without taking stuff out. That doesn't work, but I keep trying. But you're probably going to add stuff in. You're probably going to need to take stuff out. You're going to probably find that theories are going to change. Knowledge in your field are going to change. Your PowerPoints have to change to reflect that changing knowledge. I will offer a caveat here. If you get too deep in the weeds of revising your PowerPoints, this can take all of your time. So I do recommend that you give yourself some time to reasonably make some changes, but to not spend all of your time working on those PowerPoints. My 10th recommendation for teaching with PowerPoint, and you've heard me say this a little bit before, is to remember that PowerPoint is a tool that helps you teach. PowerPoint doesn't teach anything. PowerPoint provides information that helps us teach content. And it does a wonderful job in doing that. It's a great organizational tool. But remember, the onus is on you to teach that content, not just to click through slides. I think some people have vilified PowerPoint over the years. I think they've said, PowerPoint is the reason that classes are not engaging and that. And I think that's completely untrue. I think it's up to us to use PowerPoint well as a very engaging tool to structure the content for our students and to help them learn. Having said that, I don't use PowerPoint in all of my classes. I don't use it in my seminar classes. I often don't use it in some of my upper level classes. But I think in some of my survey level classes, some of my introductory level classes, it is a wonderful way to share content with my students. So if it works for you, definitely use it, but make sure you're using it right. In the comments below, I would love you to share your tips on how to use PowerPoint well in your classes, or to share some of those things we shouldn't do when we're using PowerPoint when we teach. Thank you for watching this episode of Engage the Sage. Please like, subscribe, sign up for notifications, share us on social media, and we'll see you next time on Engage the Sage.